Hello everyone. Before we start, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment with where you're from and what time you're watching. That way, YouTube will keep showing you stories just like this one. Now, let's begin. The call came in on a Tuesday morning while I was drinking my third cup of coffee and scrolling through staging photos on Pinterest. My business partner Jenna and I had been running our home staging company for about 5 years by then, mostly working on standard suburban homes that just needed a little zhuzhing before hitting the market. We'd seen our share of cluttered basements and outdated kitchens, but nothing could have prepared us for what we found at the old Victorian on Maple Street. The realtor, a jumpy woman named Beverly, had practically begged us to take the job, offering double our usual rate if we could start immediately. She mentioned something about the owner's granddaughter refusing to go upstairs, claiming the house made her feel sick, but I figured it was just grief talking. Old houses carry memories, and losing a grandparent can make those memories feel heavy. When Jenna and I pulled up to the property that afternoon, the first thing I noticed was how the house seemed to lean away from the street, like it was trying to hide behind the overgrown hedges. The paint was peeling in long strips that reminded me of skin after a bad sunburn, and the windows on the second floor were so dirty they looked like cataracts. Beverly met us at the front door with a key ring that must have had 30 keys on it, her hands fumbling as she searched for the right one. She kept glancing up at the second floor windows and licking her lips nervously, which should have been my first real warning sign. The front door opened with a groan that sounded almost human, and the smell hit us immediately. Not decay or mold like you might expect, but something medicinal mixed with the sour tang of old sweat and fear. The living room was frozen in time, probably untouched since the early 2000s, with floral wallpaper that had water stains spreading across it like brown flowers blooming between the roses. But it was the dust that caught my attention first. Thick layers of it on every surface except for these weird patterns. There were handprints everywhere, pressed into the dust on the coffee table, the windowsills, even low on the walls near the baseboards. Not child-sized prints, but adult hands, and they all seemed to be reaching toward the staircase. Jenna noticed them too and shot me a look that said we were both thinking the same thing. Beverly stayed near the door, clutching her clipboard and talking too fast about the house's good bones and original hardwood floors, but her voice kept cracking whenever she mentioned the previous owner, Mrs. Eleanor Whitman, who had apparently lived here alone for the last 15 years of her life. The kitchen told a different story than the dusty living room. It was too clean, almost sterile, with industrial-strength locks on all the cabinets and the refrigerator. Not baby-proofing locks. These were heavy-duty padlocks that looked like they belonged on storage units. The kitchen table had 4 chairs, but only one showed any signs of use, with deep grooves worn into the arms where someone had gripped them repeatedly. There were scratch marks on the floor around that chair, forming a perfect semicircle, like someone had been trying to scoot back but couldn't move far. Jenna opened one of the few unlocked drawers and found it full of plastic spoons. Nothing else, just hundreds of white plastic spoons bundled together with rubber bands. The granddaughter, Beverly explained while staring at her shoes, had mentioned that her grandmother had become difficult in her final years, but family had taken care of her at home because that's what Eleanor had wanted. We decided to start with the first floor since Beverly made it clear she wasn't going upstairs with us. As we worked, clearing out old magazines and wiping down surfaces, I kept finding more of those handprints. They were under the dining table, behind the couch, even inside the coat closet. Always adult-sized, always seeming to reach in the same direction. The strangest part was that some of them had been there so long that the dust had settled on top of them too, creating these layered impressions like archaeological evidence of desperation. In the hallway, I found a series of scratches on the hardwood floor that led from the kitchen to the stairs. Too regular to be accidental, too deep to be from furniture. They looked like someone had been dragged, their fingernails catching on the wood grain. When I showed them to Jenna, she pointed out that there were matching scratches on the wall at hip height, as if someone had been trying to hold onto the doorframe. The bathroom on the first floor made my skin crawl in ways I still can't fully explain. The lock was on the outside of the door, installed backwards, with scratches all around the handle. Inside, the bathtub had restraint marks, 4 worn spots where something had been attached to the porcelain, leaving permanent indentations. The medicine cabinet had been emptied except for bottles of sleeping pills, all prescribed to Eleanor Whitman, but with different doctors' names, dates spanning several years. There was a bucket in the corner with a lid that had been screwed shut, and neither of us wanted to open it. The mirror had been covered with newspaper dated from 3 years ago, the edges carefully taped down. When I peeled back a corner, I found that someone had scratched words into the glass underneath. Please and hungry, and what looked like tally marks, hundreds of them, covering every inch of the mirror's surface. By the time we'd finished documenting the first floor, the sun was starting to set, casting long shadows through the filthy windows. Beverly had left an hour earlier, claiming she had another showing, but not before sliding an envelope with cash across the table and making us promise we'd finish the job. The house felt different as darkness approached, colder despite the warm evening, and there was this weight to the air that made breathing feel like work. Jenna suggested we come back tomorrow for the second floor, but we both knew we needed to see this through. The stairs creaked under our feet, each step sounding like a joint popping, and that medicinal smell grew stronger with every step we climbed. At the top of the stairs, we found a hallway with 4 doors, all of them closed, all of them with locks on the outside. The carpet runner was worn thin in a path that led to only 1 door, the last one on the right. The first 3 rooms were storage, packed floor to ceiling with medical supplies, adult diapers, restraints, and boxes of nutritional drinks that had expired years ago. But it was the organized chaos that disturbed me most. Someone had been stockpiling these items obsessively, labeling everything with dates and quantities, like they were preparing for a siege. The third room had a desk covered in paperwork, powers of attorney, life insurance policies, bank statements, all in Eleanor's name but with signatures that clearly weren't hers. Jenna found a stack of notebooks filled with daily logs written in cramped handwriting, detailing medication schedules, bathroom breaks, and behavioral incidents that were described in clinical, detached language. The entries went back years, and the person writing them referred to Eleanor as the patient, or sometimes just it. The last door, Eleanor's room, was different from the others. The lock was newer, heavier, and there were fresh scratches around it, as if it had been opened recently. When we pushed the door open, the smell nearly knocked us backward, that same medicinal stench mixed with something else, something organic and wrong. The room was dark, heavy curtains nailed over the windows, but our flashlights revealed a scene that still visits me in nightmares. The bed was in the center of the room, a hospital-style bed with rails and restraint straps still attached. The mattress had a permanent indent in the shape of a body, and the sheets, though washed, had stains that would never come out. Around the bed, the hardwood floor was worn smooth in a perfect circle, as if someone had paced endlessly around it. The walls were covered in padding up to about waist height, the kind you'd see in psychiatric facilities, but it was torn in places where fingernails had clawed through to the plaster beneath. What made us both stop breathing was the bed itself. It was moving. Not dramatically, just a subtle shift every few seconds, the mattress compressing slightly as if invisible weight was settling onto it. The pillow would indent, hold for a moment, then slowly return to its original shape. Jenna grabbed my arm hard enough to bruise, and we both watched as the restraint straps tightened on their own, pulling taut against nothing before going slack again. The room's temperature dropped so fast our breath came out in clouds, and that's when we heard it. A wet, raspy breathing that seemed to come from the bed itself. Not from above or below, but from within the mattress, as if something was trapped inside. The breathing got louder, more labored, and the bed's movements became more agitated, the whole frame starting to shake against the floor. We ran. There's no other way to describe it. We abandoned our equipment, our professional dignity, everything, and we ran down those stairs like the house was on fire. But as we reached the bottom, We heard footsteps above us, slow and shuffling, moving from the bedroom toward the stairs. The footsteps had a weird rhythm, like someone dragging one leg, and there was this sound of metal clinking that I realized must have been restraints still attached. Jenna fumbled with the front door lock while I stood frozen, watching the top of the stairs. A shadow appeared there, hunched and wrong, and I could smell that medicinal stench getting stronger. The shadow started down the stairs, one agonizing step at a time, and I could hear labored breathing getting closer. Just as the figure reached the middle of the staircase, Jenna got the door open, and we burst out into the night, not stopping until we reached our van. We drove straight to Jenna's house and spent the night researching Eleanor Whitman. What we found made everything worse. Eleanor had died 6 weeks ago, but according to her bank records, someone had been cashing her Social Security checks for almost 2 years after her supposed death date. The granddaughter we'd heard about lived across the country and hadn't seen Eleanor in over a decade. The family caregiver mentioned in those logs? We found a death certificate for Eleanor's nephew from 8 years ago. Whoever had been in that house with Eleanor, keeping her prisoner in that room, documenting her every moment. They weren't family. We called the police that night and reported everything, but when they went to investigate the next morning, the house was empty. Not just of people, but of everything we'd seen. The locks, the medical supplies, the notebooks, even the scratches on the floors, all gone. The only thing they found was the bed, still in that upstairs room, and it was still moving. Beverly called us a week later, her voice shaking. The house had been pulled from the market after 3 different contractors refused to enter the upstairs bedroom. She mentioned that a cleaning crew had found something wedged deep inside the mattress, a set of dentures, a wedding ring, and finger bones, all belonging to Eleanor. But here's what keeps me up at night. The medical examiner said those bones showed signs of being gnawed on, with teeth marks that didn't match any animal they could identify. The house is still standing empty on Maple Street, and sometimes I drive by it, though I don't know why. Last month I saw lights on in that upstairs bedroom and a shadow pacing in circles around where the bed used to be. I've stopped doing home staging. Jenna moved to another state, and every night when I close my eyes, I can still hear that wet, desperate breathing and the sound of restraints pulling tight against empty air. I'd been an electrician for 15 years when Melissa and I finally bought our first house. She'd just finished her nursing degree, and we were done with apartment living in Albuquerque. The property sat 40 miles outside the city, 5 acres of New Mexico desert with a 2-story farmhouse that hadn't been updated since the 70s. Orange shag carpet, wood paneling everywhere, popcorn ceilings that probably had asbestos. But the bones were solid, and the price, almost suspiciously low. The realtor mentioned something vague about the previous owners, the Thompsons, having to leave suddenly due to medical issues. They'd lived there for decades, apparently. The whole transaction felt rushed, like everyone involved just wanted it done quickly. The basement was a disaster from day one. We went down there during our first walkthrough, and I remember Melissa grabbing my arm when she saw the state of it. Boxes stacked floor to ceiling, old furniture covered in dusty sheets, filing cabinets that looked like they hadn't been opened in years. The smell hit you immediately, that mixture of mildew, old paper, and something else I couldn't quite identify. Mouse droppings, maybe. The previous owners had left everything behind, which should have been our first red flag. The realtor assured us they'd arranged for someone to clear it out before closing, but that never happened. By the time we got the keys, we were too excited about the house to make a fuss about it. We figured we'd tackle it ourselves, make a weekend project out of it. How wrong we were. We spent the first month focusing on the main floors, new paint, ripping out that awful carpet, updating the electrical panel, the usual stuff. The basement became our dumping ground for tools and supplies. Every time I went down there, I'd tell myself we'd get to it soon. But between my work contracts and Melissa's new job at the hospital, time kept slipping away. It wasn't until a particularly hot Thursday in August that I finally decided to start clearing it out. Melissa was pulling a double shift, and I had a rare day off. Armed with garbage bags, work gloves, and a dust mask, I descended those creaky wooden stairs. The single bulb hanging from the ceiling cast harsh shadows across all that accumulated junk. I started with the nearest pile, tossing moldy magazines and broken Christmas decorations into bags. About 3 hours in, I'd cleared a path along the east wall. That's when I saw it. Behind a massive oak wardrobe and several stacks of water-damaged boxes, there was a door. Not your typical basement door either. This thing was industrial-grade steel, painted that institutional gray you see in old factories. Heavy-duty hinges, a serious deadbolt, and what looked like a newer addition. A thick padlock securing a hasp that had been welded to the frame. The door looked completely out of place in this residential basement. I stood there, sweat dripping down my back despite the cool underground air, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. In all my years doing electrical work in people's homes, I'd never encountered anything quite like this. I tried the padlock first, giving it a few experimental tugs. Solid as a rock. The thing was relatively new too, maybe a year or two old at most. Definitely not something from when the house was built. I grabbed my phone and called Melissa at work. She picked up on the third ring, sounding tired. When I told her about the door, she went quiet for a moment. "Maybe it's just storage," she said, but I could hear the unease in her voice. The Thompsons were old, right? Probably paranoid about break-ins. But that didn't explain the industrial door or the welded hasp. After she hung up to get back to her patients, I stood there staring at that gray metal surface. Part of me wanted to leave it alone, just wall it back up with the junk and pretend I never saw it. But curiosity won out. I tried searching through the boxes nearby, hoping to find keys or any documentation about what might be behind that door. The boxes yielded nothing but moth-eaten clothes and yellowed tax returns from the 80s. By evening, I'd cleared most of the basement, but that door remained a mystery. When Melissa got home around 9, we went down together with flashlights. She ran her fingers along the door frame, noting how the concrete around it looked different, newer than the rest of the basement walls. "This was added later," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Way later." We debated calling the realtor, but what would we say? That we found a locked room in our own house. Instead, I called my buddy Nathan, who worked as a locksmith. He agreed to come by on Saturday, said he'd bring his tools and see what he could do. That night, neither of us slept well. We didn't talk about it, but I know we were both thinking the same thing. What kind of room needs that level of security in a residential basement? Nathan showed up Saturday morning with a toolbox and a grim expression. He whistled low when he saw the door. "That's a Medico deadbolt," he said, kneeling down to examine the lock. "High security stuff. And this padlock, it's a shrouded shackle model, basically pick-proof." He worked on it for nearly an hour, trying different techniques while Melissa and I watched anxiously. The basement felt colder than usual, or maybe that was just my imagination. Finally, Nathan sat back on his heels and shook his head. "I'm going to have to drill it," he said. The sound of the drill boring through metal seemed to echo forever in that confined space. When the padlock finally fell away with a dull clank, we all just stood there for a moment. Nathan worked on the deadbolt next, and after another 20 minutes, we heard the mechanism click open. I pushed the door open slowly. The hinges groaned like they hadn't moved in years, which made no sense given how new that padlock had been. The smell hit us immediately. Stale air mixed with something chemical, like cleaning products gone bad. Nathan aimed his flashlight into the darkness, and we saw a narrow room, maybe 8 feet by 12 feet. The walls were covered in cheap wood paneling, and there was a single bare bulb hanging from the ceiling. But it was what filled the room that made us all take a step back. The far wall was covered in photographs, dozens of them, all showing the same woman at different ages. Some looked recent, others decades old. Below the photos sat a makeshift altar, candles, dried flowers, jewelry, and what looked like locks of hair arranged in small plastic bags. A camping cot occupied one corner, with blankets neatly folded at the foot. Empty food cans and water bottles were stacked against another wall. "Jesus Christ," Nathan breathed, taking a step backward. "You need to call the cops, right now." But I was already moving closer, drawn by a horrible fascination. The photographs showed the woman in various settings: grocery stores, parking lots, through windows. Some were taken from far away with a zoom lens. Others were uncomfortably close. In several photos, I could see our house in the background. My heart started pounding when I realized what this meant. Whoever had been in this room had been watching this woman while she lived here. The date scrawled on some of the photos went back years. Melissa grabbed my arm, her nails digging into my skin. "We're leaving," she said, her voice shaking. "We're getting out of here right now." Nathan was already backing toward the door, his face pale under the harsh fluorescent lights of the basement. We sealed the door and called the police from our kitchen. 2 officers arrived within 30 minutes, followed by detectives and a forensics team. They spent hours in that room, photographing everything, dusting for prints, bagging evidence. Detective Briggs, a tall woman with graying hair, interviewed us separately. She showed me some of the photos they'd found. The woman in them looked to be in her 50s with dark hair and a kind face. "Do you recognize her?" Briggs asked. I shook my head. She told us they'd be checking missing persons reports, trying to identify both the woman and whoever had created this shrine. They posted an officer outside our house that night, but Melissa and I still didn't sleep. We sat in our living room with all the lights on, jumping at every creak and groan of the old house. Around 3 in the morning, we heard glass breaking downstairs. The officer outside was already moving when we ran to the front door. We heard shouting from the basement, then a struggle. More officers arrived within minutes, their sirens piercing the desert quiet. They brought someone up in handcuffs, a thin man in his 60s with wild gray hair and clothes that looked like they hadn't been washed in weeks. He was screaming about his Catherine, about how we desecrated her sacred space. His eyes locked on mine as they dragged him past, and the hatred there made me stumble backward. "You don't understand," he kept saying. "She needs me to watch over her. She needs me." The police found he'd broken in through a basement window, one we hadn't even known existed, hidden behind overgrown bushes. He'd been living in that room on and off for years, they discovered, sneaking in whenever the house was empty. He had a key to the padlock and everything. The Thompsons had never known he was there. Detective Briggs called us the next week with answers that only raised more questions. The man was Harold Fitzgerald, a former janitor at the local high school. Catherine had been his co-worker there 25 years ago. She'd lived in our house with her husband back then, and Harold had developed an obsession with her. When she'd moved away after getting a restraining order, he'd somehow kept access to the house through various owners, maintaining his shrine, updating it with new photos he'd find online or from trips to wherever she'd moved. The Thompsons, elderly and rarely venturing to the basement, had never discovered him. We had the room professionally sealed with concrete blocks, but we couldn't stay. We lasted another month before putting the house back on the market. Sometimes I wonder about the new owners, if we should have told them more than just renovated basement. But mostly, I try not to think about it at all. About those nights I slept peacefully while a stranger lived beneath our feet, tending to his twisted shrine in the dark. "3 months ago, I finally closed on a house in Oak Ridge Heights, one of those new developments where everything still smells like fresh paint and the lawns are that unnatural shade of green. I'm a systems analyst, 34 years old, and after my divorce last year, I figured a fresh start in a new place would do me good. The house was perfect, 3 bedrooms, open floor plan, one of those fancy kitchen islands I'd always wanted. The development was only half finished, with construction crews still working on the lots at the end of the street, but that meant I got a great deal on mine. What I didn't expect was that my biggest problem wouldn't be noisy construction or unpacked boxes. It started on a Thursday afternoon. I was working from home, deep into debugging some code, when the doorbell rang. Through the peephole, I saw an elderly woman, maybe in her 70s, wearing a floral house dress that looked like it came straight from the 80s. Her gray hair was pinned up in this old-fashioned style, and she had these thick glasses that magnified her eyes. She was clutching a worn leather purse and shifting her weight from foot to foot, like she was anxious about something. When I opened the door, she looked at me with this expression of total confusion, then passed me into the house. "Oh," she said, her voice wavering. "You've changed everything. Where's the wallpaper, the blue wallpaper with the little roses?" Before I could respond, she stepped forward like she was going to walk right in. "I need to check the basement, dear. It's very important." I gently blocked her path, explaining that she must have the wrong house. This was a new development, I told her, built just last year. But she kept shaking her head, insisting this was her home. "The basement," she repeated, her voice getting more urgent. "I left something down there. Please, I'll only be a minute." Her eyes had this desperate quality that made me uncomfortable. I suggested maybe she was thinking of a different neighborhood, but she grabbed my arm with surprising strength. No, this is it. 1847 Maple Grove Lane. I've lived here for 40 years. The thing is, she had the address right. That detail made my skin prickle. I finally had to firmly tell her she needed to leave, and I watched her shuffle down the driveway, muttering to herself and looking back at the house every few steps. The next morning, Friday, I was having coffee in the kitchen when I saw her again through the window. She was standing at the edge of my property, just staring at the house. She wore the same floral dress, carried the same purse, and had that same anxious expression. I went outside to talk to her, and it was like we were having the exact same conversation all over again. "I need to check the basement," she said, word for word. "It's very important." This time I noticed something else. She had this strange smell about her, like smoke mixed with something chemical. When I asked her name, she paused, looking confused, then said, Dolores Brennan." I told her again that this was a new house, that no one named Brennan had ever lived here, but she just kept insisting. After about 10 minutes of this circular conversation, she finally left, taking that same shuffling walk down the street. By Saturday, I was getting genuinely concerned. She showed up 3 times that day, morning, afternoon, and evening. Each time the exact same routine, the same dress, the same words, the same desperate request about the basement. During the evening visit, I noticed something that made my chest tighten. Her fingers were blackened at the tips like they'd been burned, though she didn't seem to be in any pain. I started thinking maybe she escaped from a care facility or something. I even called the non-emergency police line, but they said unless she was threatening or trying to break in, there wasn't much they could do. They suggested I contact Adult Protective Services on Monday. That night, I installed a doorbell camera, partly for security but mostly because I wanted proof that this was really happening. Sunday was when things got truly weird. I woke up around 3 a.m. to the sound of someone trying the basement door from outside, the one that leads directly to the basement from the backyard. Through my bedroom window, I could see her silhouette in the moonlight, pulling at the handle, pressing her face against the small window. I grabbed my phone and started recording as I flipped on the backyard lights. But when the lights came on, nobody was there. The door was still slightly rattling, like it had just been released. I checked the doorbell camera footage, and it showed her walking up to the house at 2:47 a.m., but then nothing. No footage of her leaving. She just vanished from the frame while still in the middle of my driveway. I didn't sleep the rest of the night, sitting in my living room with every light in the house on. Monday morning, I decided to talk to my neighbors. Most of the houses around me were still empty, but there was an older couple, the Johnsons, living 3 houses down. They'd been here since before the development started. When I described Dolores Brennan to Mrs. Johnson, her face went pale. She grabbed her husband's arm and they exchanged this look that made my heart race. "You need to come inside," she said quietly. In their living room, over coffee that I couldn't drink because my stomach was in knots, they told me about the house that used to stand where mine is now. It belonged to a woman named Dolores Brennan who lived alone after her husband died. Strange woman, Mr. Johnson said. Always worried about her basement. Had all these important papers down there, she said. Never let anyone near it. Mrs. Johnson pulled out her phone and showed me a photo from a neighborhood Facebook group dated 2 years ago. It was a news article about a house fire. The headline made me dizzy. Elderly woman dies in basement during house fire on Maple Grove Lane. The article was brief, mentioning that Dolores Brennan, 74, had died of smoke inhalation after being trapped in her basement during an electrical fire. But here's what made me nearly drop the phone. The fire department reported that the basement door had been locked from the outside. The case was investigated but went cold. No one could explain how she ended up locked down there. The house was demolished 6 months later, and the lot sat empty until the development company bought it. We tried to tell them, Mrs. Johnson whispered. Told them something wasn't right about that land. But money talks, you know. I drove home in a daze, my mind racing. When I pulled into my driveway, she was there again, standing by my front door. But this time she looked different. Her dress was singed at the edges, and dark soot marks covered her arms. The smell of smoke was overwhelming. She turned to me as I got out of my car, and her eyes weren't confused anymore. They were terrified. "Please," she said, her voice raspy and urgent. "I need to get to the basement. They're coming back. They always come back on Mondays to check if I'm still alive. The papers, I hid the papers behind the water heater. The proof of what they did." She grabbed my shoulders, and her hands were ice cold despite the burn marks. "They killed Howard first, made it look like a heart attack. I knew I was next. I have the evidence. Please, just let me get the papers before they come back." I stumbled backward, my rational mind fighting with what I was experiencing. This couldn't be real. But the cold from her grip lingered on my shoulders, and the smell of smoke was making me nauseous. "Who's they?" I managed to ask. She looked around frantically, then leaned in close. "The development company. My nephew worked for them. Howard found out about the permits, the bribes, the inspections they faked. We were going to the authorities. But then Howard died, and I knew." She trailed off, staring at something behind me. Her face contorted in absolute terror. "They're here," she whispered. "Monday, it's Monday, they always check on Mondays." She ran toward my house, passing right through the closed front door. I stood there, paralyzed, as a white van with no company logos pulled up to my curb. 2 men got out, both wearing generic maintenance uniforms. One was tall and thin with a gray beard, the other shorter and muscular with dead eyes. They walked past me like I wasn't there, heading straight for my backyard. My legs finally worked and I followed them, my phone already recording. They went directly to the basement door, and the shorter one pulled out a key to my house that I had never given anyone. As they opened the door, I heard something from inside the basement, a sound like papers rustling frantically. The tall one said, "Still at it, aren't you?" to no one I could see. They descended the stairs and I crept closer to the doorway. Through the window I could see them standing in my basement, looking at the corner where my water heater was installed. The shorter one laughed, a cold sound that made bile rise in my throat. "Every Monday, like clockwork. 2 years and she's still trying to get those papers. Too bad we burned them with her." That's when I understood. They knew she was there. They could see her, had been coming back every Monday to... What? Torment her? Make sure she was still trapped? I thought about calling 911, but what would I say? Instead, I did something possibly stupid but definitely necessary. I quietly went through my front door, grabbed my laptop and car keys, and slipped out the side garage. As I drove away, I saw them emerging from the basement, looking satisfied. I went straight to the police station and filed a report about the break-in, showing them the video. The investigation that followed uncovered exactly what Dolores had been trying to tell people. Massive fraud, forged inspection documents, and yes, 2 suspicious deaths that were suddenly reopened as murder cases. The development company executives were arrested within a month. I never went back to that house. I stayed in a hotel until I could arrange for movers to get my things. The last text I got from the moving crew leader was strange. Found a bunch of old papers behind the water heater. Looks like legal documents from years ago. Want us to pack them? I told them yes, and when I finally got those boxes, the papers were there. Permits, correspondence, proof of everything. Dolores Brennan had hidden copies where she died trying to reach them. I turned everything over to the FBI, and now I live in a different state. But sometimes on Monday mornings, I still smell smoke and feel cold hands on my shoulders, and I know she's finally at peace. Finally had my own place at 27. After years of cramped apartments with roommates who never cleaned and walls so thin I could hear every conversation, closing on that little house in Cleveland felt like winning the lottery. Nothing fancy, just a 2-bedroom ranch with original hardwood floors and a kitchen that hadn't been updated since the 70s. But it was mine. The inspection went smoothly. The previous owners left it spotless, and I spent my first week there just walking around, touching the walls, still not believing I actually owned something. The neighborhood seemed perfect too. Quiet streets lined with mature oak trees, kids riding bikes in the afternoons, and neighbors who waved when they walked their dogs past my front yard. The house next door caught my attention right away, not because it was remarkable, but because it seemed frozen in time. Paint peeling off the shutters, grass always just a bit too long, newspapers piling up on the porch until someone, I never saw who, would collect them all at once. Mrs. Garrison lived there alone, the mailman told me when I asked. Said she'd been there 40 years, maybe more, kept to herself since her husband passed. I'd catch glimpses of her sometimes, just a pale face behind dusty curtains that would drop the second I looked over. Figured she was just one of those private people, maybe dealing with grief in her own way. We all had our quirks, right? Mine was reorganizing my garage at midnight when I couldn't sleep. Hers was apparently watching the neighborhood from behind old lace curtains. The watching started getting more noticeable after my 3rd week there. I'd be grilling burgers in the backyard, and there she'd be, standing perfectly still at her kitchen window, not even pretending to do dishes or anything. Just standing, staring. Her face barely visible through the glass, but I could make out her white hair pulled back tight, and these thick glasses that reflected the light. When I'd wave, trying to be neighborly, you know, she wouldn't wave back, wouldn't move at all. Just kept staring until I went inside. Started happening when I mowed the lawn too. I'd push the mower across my front yard and feel eyes on me, look up, and sure enough, she'd be at a different window, always watching. The curtains in her living room had this gap, maybe 3 inches wide, and her eye would be right there, unblinking. Then came the morning I found her teeth. Not dentures, but this partial bridge, just lying there in my backyard near the fence that separated our properties. Pink plastic and metal, still damp with saliva, sitting on my grass like some disturbing calling card. The fence was 6 feet high. No way it fell over by accident. I stood there holding this thing, trying to process how someone's dental work ended up in my yard, when I heard her screen door creak open. She was standing on her porch in this faded blue housecoat, mouth slightly open, and I could see the gap where the teeth should have been. "Those belong to me," she said, her voice raspy like she hadn't spoken in days. Her hand stretched out, fingers trembling, beckoning me closer. Something about the way she said it, not asking but stating, made every hair on my neck stand up. I walked over and handed her the teeth through the fence, trying to keep my distance. She snatched them quickly, popped them right back in her mouth without even rinsing them off, and then smiled at me. Not a friendly smile, but something else entirely. Her lips stretched too wide, showing those teeth that were still speckled with grass and dirt from my yard. "You look just like him," she whispered, pressing her face against the chain link, "just like my boy." Before I could ask what she meant, she turned and shuffled back inside, that housecoat dragging across her porch. I stood there for a good 5 minutes, trying to make sense of what just happened. Checked my security cameras later. hoping to see how those teeth got there. The footage showed her at 3 in the morning, pressing something through a gap under the fence with a long stick. That's when the doorbell started. First time was that same night, around 11. I'd been watching TV trying to forget the whole teeth incident when the bell rang. Checked the peephole, nothing. Opened the door cautiously, nobody there. But I could see her porch light on next door, and the curtain in her front window swaying like someone had just moved away from it. 20 minutes later, it rang again. This time I didn't even check, just ignored it. But she kept going. 11:20, 11:40, midnight, 12:15. Each time I'd hear her screen door squeak open right before my bell would ring, then squeak closed right after. By the 7th time, I was pacing my living room, debating whether to call the cops over someone ringing my doorbell. Seemed like such a minor thing to report, but the regularity of it, the obsessiveness, made my skin crawl. The next few days blurred together in this nightmare routine. She'd ring the bell at all hours, during my morning coffee, while I was in the shower in the middle of dinner. I disconnected it eventually, but then she started knocking. Not normal knocking either, but this rhythmic pattern. 3 quick taps, pause, 3 more, pause over and over. I'd come home from work to find her sitting on my front steps, that same housecoat now stained with what looked like food, maybe coffee. "Where have you been?" she'd ask, like I owed her an explanation. "I made your favorite casserole, the one with the green beans you used to love." I'd never met this woman before buying this house, never shared a meal with her, definitely never told her about any food preferences. But she'd say these things with such conviction, such hurt in her voice when I'd tell her to leave, that I started doubting my own memory. Thursday night changed everything. I'd had enough of the harassment and finally called the police earlier that day. They'd spoken to her, told me she seemed confused but harmless, suggested I be patient since she was elderly and probably dealing with dementia. I was in bed around 1 in the morning when I heard my back door handle jiggling. Not the doorbell this time, not knocking, but someone actively trying to get in. I grabbed the baseball bat I kept by my bed and crept toward the kitchen. Through the window, I could see her silhouette, hunched over my door handle with something in her hand. The moonlight caught it just right, a knife, one of those old butcher knives with the wooden handle. She was trying to jimmy the lock while muttering something I couldn't make out. My heart hammered so hard I thought she might hear it through the door. I called 911 while watching her work at the lock, whispering to the dispatcher, afraid if I spoke too loud she'd hear me and do something unpredictable. The operator told me to stay put. Units were on the way, but then I heard the lock click. She'd gotten it open. The door swung inward and there she stood, that knife clutched in her right hand, her eyes wild behind those thick glasses. "There you are," she said, stepping into my kitchen like she belonged there. "You've been hiding from me, haven't you? Just like before, just like when you left me." She moved toward me, surprisingly quick for someone her age, and I barely got the bat up in time to block her first swing. The knife scraped along the aluminum with this horrible screech. "You promised you'd never leave again," she screamed, spit flying from her mouth. "You promised, Tommy, my beautiful boy." The struggle felt like it lasted forever but was probably only 30 seconds. She kept swinging that knife, screaming about promises I'd never made, calling me Tommy, saying I'd stolen years from her. I managed to knock the knife from her hand with the bat. It clattered across my kitchen floor and spun under the refrigerator. Without the weapon, she launched herself at me, all fingernails and teeth. This 70-something-year-old woman fighting like something possessed. I dropped the bat, trying to hold her wrists, both of us crashing into my kitchen table, chairs flying. She was screaming about the war, about letters that never came, about a wedding she'd planned. I finally managed to pin her arms, held her down on the floor while she thrashed and spit and called me every name imaginable. The sirens were getting closer, but those few minutes felt like hours, her strength fueled by whatever delusion had taken hold of her mind. When the police arrived, she went completely limp in my grip, like someone had cut her strings, started sobbing, calling for her mother, asking why the soldiers were in her house. The officers had to practically carry her out. This frail old woman who'd just tried to kill me now, looking like she might blow away in a strong wind. One officer stayed to take my statement while the paramedics checked me over. Scratches down both arms, bruised ribs from hitting the table, but nothing serious. They found the knife under my fridge, bagged it as evidence. Turns out Mrs. Garrison had a son named Thomas who died in Vietnam in 1969. Been sending letters to him at various addresses for decades, the officer told me. My house had been one of them, back when different people lived here. She'd been cycling through these episodes for years, but this was the first time she'd gotten violent. They took her to a psychiatric facility that night for evaluation. I spent the next 3 days cleaning up the mess, fixing the lock she'd damaged, trying to scrub the feeling of her fingernails out of my skin. The other neighbors finally started talking to me, sharing their own stories about her strange behavior over the years. Packages left on doorsteps addressed to Tommy, midnight gardening sessions where she'd plant flowers that were already dead, conversations with people who weren't there. They all seemed to think I'd overreacted by calling the police. "She's just confused," they'd say. But they hadn't seen her with that knife, hadn't felt her trying to claw their eyes out. I installed new locks, a security system, cameras covering every angle. Started sleeping with that bat next to my bed again. Couldn't bring myself to cook in that kitchen anymore. Kept seeing her standing there every time I turned on the lights. 6 months later, I sold the house and moved across town. Lost money on the sale, but I didn't care. Some things you can't put a price on, and peace of mind is one of them. Never did find out if she was released or stayed in treatment. Never wanted to know. The closing was supposed to be the happiest day of our lives. My wife Ashley and I had been searching for months, getting outbid on every decent property in our price range until we found this place on Cedar Mill Lane. A complete gut renovation, the realtor said. Everything brand new. Hardwood floors, stainless steel appliances, even one of those fancy smart home systems that controlled everything from your phone. The previous owner had apparently been some tech enthusiast who'd wired the whole place himself before they found him dead in the living room. Heart attack, the realtor assured us quickly. Natural causes, nothing to worry about. We moved in on a Thursday in early September, boxes stacked to the ceiling, our whole life packed into a U-Haul that barely fit in the driveway. The first few days were perfect. We unpacked, arranged furniture, hung pictures on the freshly painted walls. The smart home system was incredible. I could dim the lights from my phone, adjust the thermostat without getting up from the couch, even start the coffee maker from bed. Ashley loved how the blinds would automatically adjust based on the time of day, letting in just the right amount of sunlight. We felt like we were living in the future. But then Sunday night came, and at exactly 9:47 p.m., every light in the house began to flicker. Not just a quick flash, but a slow, deliberate dimming and brightening that lasted maybe 30 seconds. We were watching TV in the living room when it happened, and we both looked at each other, confused. I checked the app on my phone, but it showed all the lights at their normal settings. Must be the power grid, we figured. Old neighborhood, probably needed some infrastructure updates. Monday passed without incident, but that night at 9:47 p.m., it happened again. The exact same pattern, lights dimming and brightening in perfect synchronization throughout the entire house. This time I was in the kitchen getting a glass of water while Ashley was upstairs in the bedroom. She called down to ask if I was messing with the lights, and I told her no, it was happening down here too. We met in the hallway, both of us trying to rationalize it. Maybe the smart system had some kind of scheduled routine we didn't know about. I spent the next hour digging through the app settings, looking for any programmed scenes or automations, but found nothing. The previous owner's account had been wiped clean, the realtor said, giving us a fresh start with the system. Still, old code could be buggy, right? That's what I told myself as we went to bed. Ashley curled up closer to me than usual. Then came 3 a.m. I woke to the sound of water running. Not a drip or a leak, but full force, like someone had turned on the kitchen faucet and walked away. I lay there for a moment, listening, wondering if I was dreaming. Ashley was still asleep beside me, breathing softly. The sound continued, steady and deliberate. I slipped out of bed and padded downstairs, the hardwood floors cold under my bare feet. Sure enough, the kitchen faucet was running at full blast, water splashing against the empty sink. I turned it off and stood there in the dark kitchen, goosebumps rising on my arms. The faucet had one of those single-handle designs. You had to lift and turn it to get water flowing. This wasn't something that could happen by accident. I checked the windows, the back door, but everything was locked tight. The security system showed no breaches, no movement except for me standing there in my boxers, staring at a sink that had somehow turned itself on. I didn't tell Ashley about the faucet the next morning. She had a big presentation at work, and I didn't want to freak her out over what was probably just a plumbing issue. Water pressure, old pipes, something logical. But I worked from home that day, and I found myself watching the clock as evening approached. At 9:47 p.m., like clockwork, the lights did their dance. This time I was ready with my phone recording, but when I played back the video, the lighting looked normal. The camera couldn't capture what our eyes were seeing. Ashley noticed my filming and asked what I was doing. I finally told her about the pattern, about how it happened at the exact same time each night. She bit her lower lip, that thing she does when she's worried, and asked if we should call an electrician. I said I'd handle it in the morning. Neither of us slept well that night. We lay in bed, both pretending to sleep, both waiting. At 3:00 a.m., the water started again. This time Ashley heard it too. We went downstairs together, her hand gripping mine tight enough to hurt. The kitchen faucet was running just like before, but this time we noticed something else. The coffee maker was on, brewing a full pot. The green light glowed in the darkness, and the familiar gurgling sound filled the kitchen. The smell of fresh coffee at 3 a.m. made my skin crawl. Ashley's voice was barely a whisper when she asked me if I'd set a timer. I shook my head. We both knew these weren't malfunctions. Someone had programmed these exact times, these specific actions, but the system had been wiped clean. The realtor had promised us that. The next morning, I called the company that installed the smart home system. The technician who answered sounded bored until I explained what was happening. Then he got quiet, really quiet. He said he'd send someone out that afternoon. When I asked if he'd heard of anything like this before, he just said they'd had some issues with that particular address and hung up. Ashley stayed home from work, and we spent the morning researching the previous owner online. Gregory Walton, 67 years old, retired software engineer. The obituary was brief. Found deceased in his home after neighbors noticed newspapers piling up. No family listed, no service announced. Just a man who died alone in what was now our living room. The thought made me avoid that room for the rest of the morning, taking my laptop to the kitchen instead. The technician arrived around 2, a young guy named Brandon who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else. He went straight to the main control panel in the basement, muttering about legacy code and ghost protocols. I thought he was joking about the ghost part until I saw his face. He pulled up screen after screen of code on his tablet, scrolling through endless lines of programming. Then he stopped, staring at something on the screen. He showed us a hidden partition in the system, completely separate from the main interface. It was full of automated routines, all time-stamped, all active. Lights at 9:47 p.m., labeled evening reading. Kitchen faucet and coffee at 3 a.m., labeled early morning routine. There were dozens more. Breakfast prep at 5:30 a.m., NPR radio at 6:15 a.m., shower at 6:45 a.m. An entire life scheduled down to the minute, still running like the man never died. Brandon tried to delete the partition. His fingers flew across the tablet, entering commands, trying different approaches. But every time he thought he'd removed it, the routines would reappear seconds later. He tried disconnecting the system from the internet, thinking maybe it was pulling from a cloud backup, but the house's Wi-Fi had been off the whole time. These routines were stored locally, burned into the hardware itself. The strangest part was the power consumption. Brandon showed us the readings. The system was pulling 3 times the electricity it should need, even when idle. He asked if we'd noticed anything else unusual, and Ashley mentioned how cold certain spots in the house felt, especially near the control panel. Brandon packed up his tools quickly after that. He said he'd need to consult with his supervisor, maybe replace the entire system. As he left, he handed me his personal cell number. "If anything else happens tonight," he said, "just get out of the house." We should have listened. We should have packed our bags and gone to a hotel. But we were stubborn, and this was our home now. We'd spent everything on this place. So we stayed, telling ourselves we'd stick together, keep all the lights on, make it through one more night until Brandon could come back with a solution. At 9:47 p.m., the lights dimmed as expected. We were ready for that. But this time, something new happened. The TV turned on by itself, tuning to the local news. The volume was low, just barely audible, but we could hear the anchor's voice droning on about weather and traffic. Then the channel changed. Then again. It cycled through exactly 7 channels before turning off. Ashley checked the routine list Brandon had shown us on his tablet. Evening news check was scheduled for 9:50 p.m., exactly when it happened. We made it to midnight before the next routine kicked in. All the lights in the house suddenly turned off except for a single path. Hallway light, bathroom light, bedroom light, creating a illuminated trail from the living room to the master bedroom. "Bedtime route," Ashley whispered, remembering the label from Brandon's list. We sat frozen on the couch, watching the pathway of lights waiting for us to follow them. After 5 minutes, they turned off in reverse order, like someone had walked the route and was turning off lights behind them. That's when we heard the footsteps. Soft at first, barely distinguishable from the house's normal settling sounds. But they followed the exact path the lights had shown, from living room to hallway to stairs. Each step was perfectly timed, the rhythm of someone who'd walked this route thousands of times before. The footsteps stopped at what would have been the master bedroom door, our bedroom door. At 3 a.m., we were wide awake, huddled together in the guest room we'd escaped to. The water started in the kitchen right on schedule, but this time we heard more. Cabinet doors opening and closing. The microwave beeping. The sound of a chair scraping against the floor. Gregory Walton's entire morning routine was playing out downstairs, every sound exactly where it should be, as if he was still there making his coffee, preparing his breakfast, starting his day. Ashley was crying silently, her whole body shaking against mine. I called Brandon's cell with trembling fingers. He answered on the first ring like he'd been waiting. "Get out," he said before I could speak. I looked up the full report. Walton didn't just die in that house. He lived alone for 3 years after his wife passed. That house was his entire world. Every routine, every moment of his day, programmed into that system. And here's what the report didn't mention. They found him in his chair, but the smart home system had been responding to his voice commands for 2 weeks after the coroner determined he'd died. 2 weeks, man. The system never recognized he was gone. We grabbed our keys and ran. No shoes, no jackets, just ran to the car in our pajamas and drove. Behind us, I could see in the rearview mirror as every light in the house blazed to life, then went dark, then blazed again, like the house was having a seizure. We spent the rest of the night in a 24-hour diner, drinking terrible coffee and trying to process what Brandon had told us. At dawn, we went back with a moving crew and Brandon's entire team. They ripped out the whole system that day. Every wire, every sensor, every connected device. It took 12 hours and cost us thousands we didn't have, but we needed that house to be dumb again. Just walls and windows and manual light switches. The crew found something disturbing during the removal. A secondary power source hidden in the walls, some kind of battery backup system that wasn't on any blueprint. It was still running, still warm to the touch even though it should have died years ago. We live there still, Ashley and I. The house is different now, quieter, simpler. We use regular alarm clocks and flip switches like people did in the old days. Sometimes visitors ask why we don't have any smart home features. why we're so behind the times. We just smile and change the subject. But here's the thing that still bothers me, keeps me up some nights. For weeks after we gutted the system, at exactly 9:47 p.m., I swear I could see the shadows in the living room shift slightly, as if responding to lights that were no longer there. And sometimes, if I'm very quiet at 3 a.m., I can hear the faintest sound from the kitchen. Not water running, but the ghost of a memory of water, like an echo of a routine that refuses to die. Brandon says it's just my imagination, that patterns can burn themselves into our minds just like they burned into that system. Maybe he's right, but we keep our bedroom door locked now, and we never, ever sit in the living room chair where they found Gregory Walton. Some routines, I've learned, are harder to break than others. I need everyone here to understand that what I'm about to share isn't some creepy pasta or made-up story for internet points. I'm a 34-year-old software engineer, married to Claire, who's a nurse, and we have 6-year-old twins, Sophie and Jake. We'd been saving for years to move out of our cramped downtown apartment, and in June 2022, we finally bought our dream home on Oakwood Street. It was this beautiful colonial, with a wraparound porch and an enormous backyard. Exactly what we'd been hoping for. The previous owners, the Millers, had lived there for 40 years and left behind some old furniture, garden tools, and these 3 stone statues in the backyard. Each statue was about 4 feet tall, carved to look like children wearing those formal clothes from maybe the 1920s or 1930s. Mrs. Miller mentioned they'd been there when they bought the place. The first month was perfect. We spent weekends setting up the kids' rooms, planting a vegetable garden, and hosting barbecues for our new neighbors. The statues became part of the scenery. Sophie even named them Oliver, Penelope, and Francis. She'd have tea parties near them, setting up her plastic cups and stuffed animals in a circle. Jake preferred the swing set we installed on the opposite side of the yard. Everything felt right, like we'd finally made it to where we wanted to be in life. Claire and I would sit on the back deck after putting the kids to bed, drinking wine and talking about how lucky we were. The neighborhood was quiet, safe, the kind of place where people still borrowed sugar from each other and kids rode bikes until dark. That sense of security, that feeling that we'd found our forever home, it makes what happened next so much worse. It started on a Thursday night in early July. I'd gotten up around 2 a.m. to grab some water, too much salty popcorn during movie night. As I passed the kitchen window, I glanced out at the backyard, lit up by the motion sensor light we'd installed. The statue of Oliver, the one closest to the house, wasn't where it should have been. Instead of facing the garden like always, it was turned toward our back door, maybe 10 feet closer than usual. I rubbed my eyes, thinking I was half asleep and confused. But no, it had definitely moved. I even checked the security camera footage on my phone. At 11 p.m., Oliver faced the garden. At 2 a.m., he faced our house. The recording showed nothing in between, just a static image, like the camera had glitched for 3 hours. The next morning, I mentioned it to Claire over breakfast. She laughed, said maybe the neighborhood teenagers were playing pranks, moving things around. Made sense. The statues weren't that heavy, and kids get bored in summer. I checked the yard and found Oliver back in his original spot, facing the garden again. No footprints in the grass, nothing disturbed. I decided to let it go. That evening, I set up an old webcam in our bedroom window, pointed at the backyard, just to catch any pranksters in the act. What I saw the next night changed everything. At 1:47 a.m., all 3 statues moved. Not quickly, not like someone was carrying them. They shifted positions slowly, almost imperceptibly, like watching the hour hand on a clock. Over the course of an hour, they formed a triangle pattern in the center of the yard, all facing inward toward each other. I woke Claire up immediately, showed her the footage. Her face went pale as she watched the timestamp tick by while those stone children rearranged themselves in our yard. We both sat there in silence, trying to process what we were seeing. These weren't lightweight decorations. Each statue weighed at least 100 pounds. Claire wanted to call the police right then, but what would we say? That our garden statues were moving by themselves? They'd think we were crazy. Instead, we decided to stay up the rest of the night, watching from our bedroom window. At 4 a.m., just as the sky began to lighten, the statues moved back to their original positions. Same slow, deliberate movement, like they were on invisible tracks. By sunrise, everything looked normal again. We didn't tell the kids. How could we? But we started making changes. I installed floodlights around the yard, bought a better security system with multiple cameras, even spread flour on the grass around the statues to catch footprints. Claire wanted to just get rid of them, hire someone to haul them away, but I needed to understand what was happening. That Saturday, while the kids were at a birthday party, I examined the statues closely. No mechanisms, no tracks, nothing that could explain the movement. The stone was solid, weathered, probably decades old. Each child's face was carved with disturbing detail. Their eyes seemed to follow you, and their mouths were slightly open, like they were about to speak. I found markings on the base of each one, symbols I didn't recognize, almost like a child's drawing of stars and spirals. That night, things escalated beyond anything we could have imagined. Around midnight, our new motion sensors went crazy, lights flashing on and off like a disco. Through the window, we saw the statues moving again, but this time they weren't alone. 3 figures in white masks stood among them, perfectly still, mimicking the statues' poses. The masks were blank except for 2 holes for eyes. No mouth, no expression, nothing. They wore dark clothing that made their bodies blend into the night. Claire grabbed her phone to call 911 while I ran to check on the kids. Both were sound asleep, thank God. When I got back to our bedroom window, the masked figures were gone, but the statues had been arranged differently. They now formed a line facing our house, and at their feet lay 3 pieces of paper weighted down with rocks. I wanted to wait for the police, but Claire couldn't stand not knowing what those papers said. I grabbed a baseball bat and we went out together, leaving the back door open in case we needed to run. The notes were handwritten in red ink, each one different. The first read, "They remember what you've forgotten." The second, "Sunday brings revelation." The third just had our house number repeated over and over, filling the entire page. The police arrived 15 minutes later, took our statements, bagged the notes as evidence. Officer Daniels, a tired-looking man in his 50s, walked the perimeter of our yard with a flashlight but found nothing. No footprints in the flour I'd spread, no sign of forced entry to our property. He suggested we might want to stay somewhere else for a few nights, maybe install better locks. They'd increase patrols in our neighborhood, he promised, but without any real threats or violence, there wasn't much more they could do. We didn't sleep that night. Claire called in sick to work, and I worked from home trying to keep things normal for Sophie and Jake. Every few minutes, one of us would check the windows. The statues remained in their line formation all day, those stone eyes fixed on our house. I researched the history of our property online, finding old newspaper archives and property records. The house was built in 1953, but before that, the land had been part of a larger estate. In 1928, 3 children from the Morrison family had drowned in a pond that used to exist where our yard now sat. Their names were Oliver, Penelope, and Francis, the exact names Sophie had given the statues. My skin crawled as I showed Claire the article. Neither of us had told Sophie those names. She'd come up with them on her own, or so we'd thought. Saturday felt like walking through quicksand. Every hour dragged, building toward whatever revelation Sunday would bring. We packed emergency bags, made arrangements with Claire's sister in case we needed to leave quickly. The police drove by every few hours, giving us slight waves. Our neighbors, the Andersons and the Nguyens, checked on us after noticing the police presence. We made up a story about attempted break-ins, not wanting to sound insane. That night, we took shifts watching the yard. Around 3 a.m. during my watch, I saw movement in the shadows beyond our fence. Not the statues this time. They remained still. Multiple figures, maybe 6 or 7, stood just outside our property line. They wore the same white masks but didn't enter the yard. They just stood there watching our house, swaying slightly like wheat in the wind. I filmed them with my phone, but when I checked the footage later, it showed only darkness and static. Sunday arrived with an unnatural stillness. No birds singing, no wind. Even the traffic from the main road seemed muted. Claire took the kids to her sister's house despite their protests about missing their friend's pool party. I stayed behind with 2 police officers who'd been assigned to watch our house after I'd shown them the footage from the previous nights. Officers Rivera and Kowalski were skeptical but professional, setting up in our driveway with a clear view of the backyard. All day, nothing happened. The statues didn't move. No masked figures appeared. By evening, I started to think maybe it was over. Maybe whoever was doing this had been scared off by the police presence. Then, at exactly 9 p.m., every light in our house went out. Not a power failure. The neighbors' houses were still lit. The officers radioed for backup and approached our back door with flashlights drawn. What happened next still haunts me. The backyard filled with people. At least 20 figures in those white masks, standing in concentric circles around the statues. They held candles that gave off an unusual blue flame. In the center of their formation, the 3 statues began to sink into the ground, descending slowly like elevators. The masked figures chanted something in a language I didn't recognize, their voices creating a low, thrumming harmony that made my chest vibrate. The police officers shouted commands, but the figures didn't acknowledge them. Then, as suddenly as it began, it ended. The candles went out, the figures scattered into the darkness faster than seemed possible, and our house lights flickered back on. Where the statues had been, 3 rectangular holes gaped in our lawn, each about 6 feet deep. At the bottom of each hole lay a small metal box. The police called for the entire department to respond, turning our property into a crime scene. The metal boxes contained old photographs, children's toys from the 1920s, and handwritten letters addressed to those who disturbed the watching. The letters, written in the same red ink as our threatening notes, described a group called the Perpetual Guardians who believed the drowned children's spirits needed constant observation to remain at peace. Apparently, by living in the house and ignoring the statue's movements, we'd violated some twisted agreement the group had maintained for decades. The police found no fingerprints, no DNA evidence, nothing to identify who these people were. The department dug up our entire backyard looking for more evidence but found only the original foundations of the Morrison Estates pond. The detective in charge theorized we'd been targeted by a cult that had been monitoring the property for generations, but without catching any of them, there was no way to prove it or press charges. We stayed in a hotel for 2 weeks while the investigation continued. When we finally returned home, the holes had been filled, new sod laid where the statues once stood. The police maintained regular patrols for months, but nothing else happened. No masked figures, no mysterious notes, no movement in the night. Whatever ritual they'd completed seemed to satisfy them. We've lived here for 2 years now, and while life has returned to a kind of normal, we've never felt truly comfortable. Claire still double-checks the locks obsessively. I keep security cameras running 24/7, though they've shown nothing unusual since that Sunday. The kids don't remember much, thank God. Sometimes Sophie asks about Oliver, Penelope, and Francis, but we tell her they went to live with another family. We've thought about moving 1,000 times, but something keeps us here. Maybe stubbornness, maybe the hope that understanding what happened might come with time. All I know is that somewhere out there, those perpetual guardians are still watching, still waiting, still believing in something I'll never comprehend. I had just gotten out of a messy split and was couch hopping between friends in Richmond when the letter from a lawyer showed up. Apparently, my Uncle Carl, someone I hadn't seen since I was 9, had passed away and left me a house in a place called Elbridge Hollow, tiny town, barely on the map. I only remembered him vaguely, tall, always smelled like motor oil, and never spoke more than he had to. My mom cut ties with him for reasons she never fully explained, just called him troubled and moved on. Still, I didn't have a place of my own, and the idea of inheriting a whole house, no matter how run down, sounded like a chance to breathe. Elbridge Hollow was the kind of town where you could hear your own tires echo off the trees for miles before seeing a single street lamp. The house sat at the edge of a wooded dead-end road, with no neighbors within shouting distance. First thing I noticed pulling up, the cameras. Not just a doorbell one or something modern. These were old, clunky, box-style security cameras mounted under the eaves, all aimed inward at doors and windows. The front porch light flickered erratically, and the place had this unshakable stillness, like it had been holding its breath for years. The windows had internal bars, not decorative ones, thick steel rods, welded into the frames. Inside, it was colder than it should have been. The house smelled like rust and mothballs, and the air had that dry, dead quality of a place that hadn't had a conversation in years. I flipped a few light switches and most of them worked, surprisingly. The furniture was gone except for a battered recliner in the living room and a small safe bolted to the floor in what looked like an old study. Every room had at least one reinforced door, heavy with extra bolts on the inside, and I counted 3 different panic buttons, one under the kitchen counter, one near the back door, and a third wired into a hollowed-out light switch in the hallway. I didn't understand who he thought was coming for him, but he'd clearly spent a long time preparing. The strangest thing, though, was the basement. There was a padlock on the inside of the door, like someone wanted to keep something down there. The stairs creaked like bones with every step, and the walls were covered in this peeling, pale blue paint that reminded me of old hospitals. One section of the basement had been walled off with what looked like freshly added drywall, newer than anything else in the house. It was sealed shut with screws, not nails, and scribbled in pencil next to the wall was a phrase I couldn't stop staring at. No one comes back the same. I decided to sleep in the upstairs bedroom that first night, but I barely made it to 3 a.m. before giving up. The house never settled. There were clicking sounds inside the walls, like someone lightly tapping metal pipes with a ring. And I kept hearing faint, short beeps, single tones, spaced minutes apart, coming from places I couldn't pinpoint. The attic hatch had 4 heavy-duty locks on it, all bolted shut from below, and I wasn't about to open that thing in the dark. What finally made me grab my keys and sleep in the car was a dull thud from the basement, like someone dropped a heavy book flat on concrete. I told myself it was the house adjusting, but the next morning, the padlock on the basement door was unlatched and dangling. I spent the following days cleaning, hauling out boxes of weird junk my uncle had hoarded, mostly old electrical parts, wires, and journals filled with half-erased diagrams and scribbled notes about response conditioning and stage 4 resistance. It didn't make any sense, and I started wondering if he'd been paranoid or deeply unwell. That changed when I found the key to the safe. Inside were 2 Polaroids and a flash drive. One photo showed a man, early 20s, looking straight at the camera with a plastic zip tie around his wrist. The second was of a narrow room I hadn't seen in the house. White walls, a drain in the floor, and a single overhead bulb. It looked like a holding cell, or worse. The flash drive didn't work on my laptop. When I tried opening the only file inside, the screen glitched, froze, and then my system rebooted. After that, my Wi-Fi kept dropping in and out, and apps I hadn't opened in weeks started running in the background. I took the laptop to a repair guy in town who just raised an eyebrow and asked where I'd gotten the file. I said it came with the house. He told me to wipe the whole system. "There's stuff on here that's not yours," he said, "and someone might be watching to see what you do with it." The next night, I was woken up by motion alerts. I'd reconnected 2 of the external cameras just to see what they picked up, and one of them caught someone standing at the edge of the woods. Just standing there, arms at their sides, no movement. They stayed in the same spot for nearly 11 minutes before walking backward into the trees. Backward, not turning around. I didn't sleep after that. I kept the lights on and sat in the recliner until the sun came up, listening for any sound at all. That was the first time I started to feel like this wasn't just a weird old house. It was something left unfinished, and someone out there wasn't happy I'd come back. I couldn't stop thinking about that sealed wall in the basement. By the end of that week, curiosity won. I unscrewed every panel carefully, heart pounding the whole time. Behind it, I found a narrow hallway, more like a tunnel, lined with scuffed-up white tiles. There was a single bulb hanging from an exposed wire, and deeper inside, a door with a reinforced window. Inside that room, the walls were covered in mirrors. Not decorative ones, but tall, full-length panels, all facing inward. On the floor sat an old, leather-bound binder. It was filled with intake forms, names, dates, evaluations, people who had apparently stayed here, or been kept here. Some entries had notes like, still resisting visual therapy, or paranoia worsening after week 3. I left everything exactly where I found it and sealed the hallway back up. I didn't want to touch any of it again, but after that day I started noticing subtle changes around the house. Lights left off would be on. The faucet in the upstairs bathroom would be dripping, though I'd never used it. One morning I found muddy boot prints on the back porch. Just 2 prints, like someone stepped up to the door and vanished. I got locks changed, added deadbolts, even installed my own camera system. It didn't help. Every time I looked out the window after dark, I expected to see someone there. Sometimes I thought I did, just for a second, but when I blinked, it was gone. Eventually, I started sleeping in town at a friend's place and only coming back during the day. One afternoon, I got a call from a blocked number. The voice was male, calm, and clipped. He said, "We're aware of the reactivation. Do not attempt to continue Dr. Halden's work." Then the line went dead. I didn't know who Halden was. His name wasn't on anything I'd found. But someone believed this place had been shut down for a reason, and someone else was still watching. I sold the house as is to a developer 6 months later. Never went back after signing the papers. Every now and then, I search for the address online, just to see if anything new comes up. Nothing ever does. No listing, no record of resale. It's like it dropped off the grid. Part of me wonders if I imagine more than I want to admit. But the cameras were real. The voices were real. That binder was definitely real. Whatever my uncle was doing out there, I think someone else had been doing it long before him, and I might have just walked into a story that was never meant to have an ending.